The Civil War, a raging firestorm of events that left millions dead, wounded, and without families. What was the cause behind such a devastating war, and how did it affect not just the nation itself, but the people behind it? And did slavery really even have anything to do with the catastrophe we know as the Civil War? In many textbooks today, the Civil War was about slaves, freedom, and a mighty man named Abraham Lincoln that led the country on his shoulders. In movies, the war is a perfect atmosphere for romance and exciting adventures. Yet the war we know as the Civil War is nothing like the real one. In fact, for many, the war wasn't so much about slavery as it was a combination of misunderstood feelings and conflicts sprouting up here and there around the country. And there certainly wasn't anything romantic about getting your head blown off by a cannonball.
But the misconception that everybody in the South had slaves is incorrect. That less than 1% had slaves, and there's only 2,352 people in the entire South that had more than 100 slaves. There's not very many people when you have 7 million people.
This caused an uproar over wanting to make their own nation as the Confederate United States, and they would have probably gone their wish too, if not for the beliefs of particularly one man.
The North wanted the South to stay in operation. The North counted on the South for a lot of raw materials, for foodstuffs, for cattle, for cotton, for minerals and things that the North needed. And even Abe Lincoln said at one point, we've got to have the South with us. Who else is going to pay the bills? Ultimately, slaves were freed, after the war. Yes, that's true. Was that the incentive for the war? No.
Although the Civil War had many different reasons for even starting, the effects of the war don't have to be debated over. The tragic losses are obvious aftermaths of any war, no matter how small. But this war had many good aspects to it as well. But what could there really be as far as successes from such a tragic mess?
Medical knowledge alone that was learned from the war, all the severe, terrible injuries that occurred during the war. Medical science jumped leaps and bounds during that time period. You had physicians who were basically mechanics who could take a saw and cut somebody's arm off after it had been shot by a 58 caliber mini-ball. Men would die and bleed to death, infections. We learned a lot about hygiene. We learned a lot about how to care for severe wounds. We learned a lot about proper surgical procedures to keep men alive and women. There were women that died in this war too. There were women soldiers.
The successes of the war weren't just in the medical field. Along with the advancement of anesthetics came the first submarine, repeating rifles, and was the first war to be photographed in every aspect of the conflict. Along with these Civil War firsts came a side of the war that we all have heard of.
I think states' rights is one of that and slavery, number one and number two reasons why the Civil War even happened. It's unfortunate what happened, but how we got here, it's not us to judge where we are, and by the abolishment of slavery, that was a good thing that came out of it.
I think that probably the people right after the Civil War didn't see much success to it because it changed things so drastically during the war and after. I would think and hope that a success was that we as a country got along better after that.
In any event, the successes of war are often unseen due to the fact that, like any war, there is one overbearing fact of war: death. Above all things about war, the most tragic is the deaths of soldiers and the sense of failure on both sides of the war. While victors parade around in success, they secretly mourn the lives lost in the battles, and for those who have lost the war, there seems no hope at all of life ever being the same. For the Southerners, it would only be a short time after the Civil War ended that the real tragedies would begin to hit hard. Reconstruction was the biggest of the South's problems after the war was over. It was a period in time in which the North felt the South should be punished for seceding, and made the South know it in every conceivable way.
Reconstruction lasted until 1877, so for 12 years they had to deal with pretty much military occupation and excessive taxes and so forth. And with that, you have the birth of the Ku Klux Klan and other groups like that.
Anybody that was in the war, it was very, very difficult because they were away from their families, they were away from their farms. The women had to take on a lot of responsibilities to keep things going.
The Civil War greatly affected the people in both the North and the South, from wives nervously waiting for some sort of news of their husbands, to children no longer with parents, to those in the government at the back end of the war. However, most of the war's terrifying elements could only be experienced at the front lines, and that was where the soldiers were.
Campaign style is basically when you sleep out underneath the stars. You just throw down a blanket and that's where you sleep. And that's how a majority of them slept, which were, led to a lot of disease and rheumatism and things like that happened to them just from having that many people, that close proximity, no proper sewage or anything like that. So there's a whole lot of bacteria things that could happen, and that caused a lot of the deaths during the Civil War. But when you're on the cold ground sleeping out there 9 months out of the year, it does take a toll on the body.
The Civil War is often misunderstood in many ways. We tend to think of the soldiers as charging into battle with pristine uniforms on. Wounded men died dramatically on the screen. Slaves are on the mind of every man and woman in the country. And above all, none of the Civil War seems real enough to actually understand. And why should we? If all we ever see is the glamorization of Hollywood and the flat paintings of battle scenes, then the war will always be some exciting tale buried deep in history.
The people that write history are the victors. So when you read anything, you're going to hear one side of the story, and because the victors write the history. I don't think anybody anticipated it to be a 5-year war. I think they anticipated it to be over and done with probably within a year.
I don't think at that time we were ready to take on anything of that nature. No one was prepared to split the country in two.
In reality, the Civil War was misunderstood people fighting against people equally misunderstood. There were successes to the war and failures too. But even in the thick of it, these people, unknowingly working as a torn nation, trying to find their place in history, kept charging onward despite the difficulties.